they started together. Claire's life at the dairy had been that of a recluse in respect to the world of his own class. For months he had never gone near a town, and, requiring no vehicle, had never kept one, hiring the dairyman's cob or gig if he rode or drove. They went in the gig that day, and then, for the first time in their lives, they shopped as partners in one concern. It was Christmas Eve, with its loads of holly and mistletoe, and the town was very full of strangers who had come in from all parts of the country on account of the day. Tess paid the penalty of walking about with happiness, superadded to beauty, on her countenance, by being much stared at as she moved amid them on his arm. In the evening, they returned to the inn at which they had put up, and Tess waited in the entry while Angel went to see the horse and gig brought to the door. The general sitting room was full of guests who were continually going in and out. As the door opened and shut each time for the passage of these, the light within the parlour fell full upon Tess's face. Two men came out and passed by her among the rest. One of them had stared her up and down in surprise, and she fancied he was a Tantridge man, though that village lay so many miles off that Tantridge folks were rarities here. A comely maid that, said the other. True, comely enough, but unless I make a grand mistake. And he negatived the reminder of the remark forthwith. Claire had just returned from the stable yard, and, confronting the man on the threshold, heard the words and saw the shrinking of Tess. The insult to her stung him to the quick, and before he had considered anything at all, he struck the man on the chin with the full force of his fist, sending him staggering backwards into the passage. The man recovered himself and seemed inclined to come on, and Claire, stepping outside the door, put himself in a posture of defence. But his opponent began to think better of the matter. He looked anew at Tess as he passed her, and said to Claire, I beg pardon, sir. 'Twas a complete mistake. I thought she was another woman 40 miles from here. Claire, feeling that he had been too hasty, and that he was, moreover, to blame for leaving her standing in an inn passage, did what he usually did in such cases, gave the man 5 shillings to plaster the blow, and thus they parted, bidding each other a pacific good night. As soon as Claire had taken the reins from the ulster, and the young couple had driven off, the two men went in the other direction. And was it a mistake? Said the second one. Not a bit of it. But I didn't want to hurt the gentleman's feelings. Not I. In the meantime, the lovers were driving onward. Could we put off our wedding till a little later? Tess asked, in a dry, dull voice. I mean, if we wished. No, my love. Calm yourself. Do you mean that the fellow may have time to summon me for assault? He asked good-humouredly. No, I only meant if it should have to be put off. What she meant was not very clear, and he directed her to dismiss such fancies from her mind, which she obediently did as well as she could. But she was grave, very grave, all the way home, till she thought, we shall go away a very long distance, hundreds of miles from these parts, and such as this never can happen again, and no ghost of the past reach there. They parted tenderly that night on the landing, and Claire ascended to his attic. Tess sat up, getting on with some little requisites, lest the few remaining days should not afford sufficient time. While she sat, she heard a noise in Angel's room overhead, a sound of thumping and struggling. Everyone else in the house was asleep, and in her anxiety lest Claire should be ill, she ran up and knocked at his door. as you heard, was my pummeling away with my fists at my portmanteau, which I pulled out today for packing. I am occasionally liable to these freaks in my sleep. Go to bed and think of it no more. This was the last Jacob required to turn the scale of her indecision. Declare the past to him by word of mouth she could not, but there was another way. She sat down and wrote on the 4 pages of a note sheet a succinct narrative of those events of 3 years ago, put it into an envelope, and directed it to Claire. Then, lest the flesh should again be weak, she crept upstairs without any shoes and slipped the note under his door. Her night was a broken one, as it well might be, and she listened for the first faint noise overhead. It came as usual. He descended as usual. She descended. He met her at the bottom of the stairs and kissed her. Surely it was as warmly as ever. He looked a little disturbed and worn, she thought, but he said not a word to her about her revelation, even when they were alone. Could he have had it? Unless he began the subject, she felt she couldn't say nothing. So the day passed, and it was evident that, whatever he thought, he meant to keep to himself. Yet he was frank and affectionate as before. Could it be that her doubts were childish, that he forgave her, that he loved her for what she was, just as she really was, and smiled at her disquiet as at a foolish nightmare? Had he really received her note? She glanced into his room and could see nothing of it. It must be that he forgave her. Every morning and night he was the same, and thus New Year's Eve broke, the wedding day. The lovers did not rise at milking time, having through the whole of this last week of their sojourn at the dairy been accorded something of the position of guests, Tess being honoured with a room of her own. When they arrived downstairs at breakfast time, they were surprised to see what effects had been produced in the large kitchen to their glory since they had last beheld it. At some unnatural hour of the morning, the dairyman had caused the yawning chimney corner to be whitened, and the brick hearth reddened, and a blazing yellow damask blower to be hung across the arch in place of the old grimy blue cotton one, with a black sprig pattern which had formerly done duty here. This renovated aspect of what was the focus, indeed, of the room on a dull winter morning threw a smiling demeanour over the whole apartment. I was determined to do summit in honour of it, said the dairyman, and as you wouldn't hear of my geeing a rattling good brandy with fiddles and bass vials, complete, as we should have done in old times, this was all I could think of as a noiseless thing. Tess's friends lived so far off that none could conveniently have been present at the ceremony, even had any been asked. But as a fact, nobody was invited from Marlowe. As for Angel's family, he had written and duly informed them of the time, and assured them that he would be glad to see one at least of them there for the day, if he would like to come. His brothers had not replied at all, seeming to be indignant with him, while his father and mother had written a rather sad letter, deploring his precipitancy in rushing into marriage, but making the best of the matter by saying that, though a dairywoman was the last daughter-in-law they could have expected, their son had arrived at an age at which he might be supposed to be the best judge. This coolness in his relations distressed Claire less than it would have done had he been without the grand card with which he meant to surprise them ere long. To produce Tess, fresh from the dairy, as a d'Urberville, and a lady he had felt to be temerarious and risky. Hence he had concealed her lineage till such time as, familiarized with worldly ways by a few months' travel and reading with him, he could perception that Angel's bearing towards her still remained in no whit altered by her own communication, rendered Tess still doubtful if he could have received it. She rose from breakfast before he had finished and hastened upstairs. It had occurred to her to look once more into the queer, gaunt room which had been Claire's den, or rather airy, for so long, and, climbing the ladder, she stood at the open door of the apartment, regarding and pondering. She stooped to the threshold of the doorway, where she had pushed in the note 2 or 3 days earlier in such excitement. The carpet reached close to the sill, and under the edge of the carpet she discerned the faint white margin of the envelope containing her letter to him, which she obviously had never seen, owing to her having, in her haste, thrust it beneath the carpet as well as beneath the door. With a feeling of faintness, she withdrew the letter. There it was, sealed up, just as it had left her hands. The mountain had not yet been removed. She could not let him read it now, the house being in full bustle of preparation, and descending to her own room, she destroyed the letter there. She was so pale when he saw her again that he felt quite anxious. The instant of the misplaced letter overwhelmed her. What could she do at this moment? Everything was in a stir. There was coming and going. All had to dress, the dairyman and Mrs. Crick having been asked to accompany them as witnesses, and reflection and deliberate talk were well nigh impossible. The only minute Tess could get to be alone with Claire was when they met upon the landing. "I'm so anxious to talk to you, and want to confess all my faults and blunders," she said, with attempted lightness. No, we can't have faults talked of. You must be deemed perfect today, at the least." "Sweet," he cried, "we shall have plenty of time hereafter, I hope, to talk over our failings. I will confess mine at the same time. But it would be better for me to do it now, I think, so that you could not say, 'Well, you shall tell me anything,' say as soon as we are settled in our lodging. Not now. I, too, will tell you my faults then. But do not let us spoil the day with them. They will be excellent matter for talk. What long suffering it guaranteed, what honesty, what endurance, what good faith. As they came out of church, the ringers swung the bells up their rests, and a limited peal of 3 notes broke forth. The power of expressing joy in such a small parish, ranging no further. Passing by the tower with her husband on the path to the gate, she could feel the vibrant air humming round them from the louvred belfry in a circle of sound, and it matched the highly charged mental atmosphere in which she was living. This condition of exaltation, wherein she felt glorified by an irradiation not her own, like the angel whom St. John saw in the sun, lasted till the sound of the church bells had died away, and the emotions of the wedding service had calmed down. Her eyes could dwell upon details more clearly now, and Mr. and Mrs. Crick, having directed their own gig to be sent for them, to leave their carriage to the young couple, she observed the build and character of that conveyance for the first time. Sitting in silence, she regarded it long. "I fancy you seem oppressed, Tessie," said Claire. "Yes," she answered, putting her hand to her brow. "I tremble at many things. It is all so serious, Angel. Among other things, I seem to have seen this carriage before, to be very well acquainted with it. It is very odd. I must have seen it in a dream. Oh, you've heard the legend of the D'Urberville coach, that well-known superstition of this county about your family when they were very popular here, and this lumbering old thing reminds you of it?" "I have never heard of it, to my knowledge," said she. "What is the legend? May I know it?" "Well, I would rather not tell it in detail just now. A certain D'Urberville of the 16th or 17th century committed a dreadful crime in his family coach, and since that time members of the family see or hear the old coach whenever. But I'll tell you another day. It is rather gloomy. Evidently some dim knowledge of it has been brought back to your mind by the sight of this venerable caravan." "I don't remember hearing it before," she murmured. "Is it when we are going to die, Angel, that members of my family see it, or is it when we have committed a crime?" "Now, Tess," he silenced her by a kiss. By the time they reached home, she was contrite and spiritless. She was Mrs. Angel Clare, indeed, but had she any moral right to the name? Was she not more truly Mrs. Alexander D'Urberville? Had intensity of love any power to justify what might possibly be considered in upright souls as culpable reticence? She knew not what was expected of women in such cases. She had no counsellor. However, when she found herself alone in her room for a few minutes, the last day this on which she was ever to enter it, she knelt down and prayed. She prayed to God, but it was her husband who really had her supplication. Her idolatry of this man was such that she herself almost feared it to be ill-omened. She was conscious of the notion expressed by Friar Lawrence. These violent delights have violent ends. It might be too desperate for human conditions, too rank, too wild, too deadly. "Oh, my love, why do I love you so?" she whispered, there alone. "She you love is not my real self, but one in my image, the one I might have been." Afternoon came, and with it the hour of departure. They had decided to fulfill the plan of going for a few days to the lodgings in the old farmhouse near Wellbridge Mill, at which he meant to reside during his investigation of flour processes. At 2 o'clock there was nothing left to do but to start. All the servantry of the dairy were standing in the red brick entry to see them go out, the dairyman and his wife following to the door. Tess saw her 3 chambermaids in a row against the wall, pensively inclining their heads. She had much questioned if they would appear at the parting moment, but there they were, stoical and staunch to the last. She knew why the delicate Letty looked so fragile, so blank, and she forgot her own dogging shadow for a moment in contemplating theirs. She impulsively whispered to him, "Will you kiss them all once, poor things, for the first and last time?" Claire had not the least objection to such a farewell formality, which was all that it was to him, and as he passed them, he kissed them in succession where they stood, saying goodbye to each as he did so. When they reached the door, Tess femininely glanced back to discern the effect of that kiss of charity. There was no triumph in her glance, as there might have been. If there had, it would have disappeared when she saw how moved the girls all were. The kiss had obviously done harm by awakening feelings they were trying to subdue. All of this, Claire was unconscious. Passing on to the wicket gate, he shook hands with the dairyman and his wife, and expressed his last thanks to them for their attentions. After which there was a moment of silence before they moved off. It was interrupted by the crowing of a cock. The white one with the rose comb had come and settled on the palings in front of the house, within a few yards of them, and his notes thrilled their ears through, dwindling away like echoes down a valley of rocks. "Oh," said Mrs. Craig, "an afternoon crow." Two men were standing by the yard gate, holding it open. "That's bad," one murmured to the other, not thinking that the words could be heard by the group at the door wicket. The cock crew again, straight towards Claire. "Well," said the dairyman. "I don't like to hear him," said Tess to her husband. "Tell the man to drive on. Goodbye, goodbye." The cock crew again. "Hush, just you be off, sir, or I'll twist your neck," said the dairyman with some irritation, turning to the bird and driving him away. And to his wife as they went indoors, "Now, to think o' that just today. I've not heard his crow of an afternoon all the year afore." "It only means a change in the weather," said she. "Not what you think. 'Tis impossible." Chapter 34. They drove by the level road along the valley to a distance of a few miles, and, reaching Wellbridge, turned away from the village to the left and over the great Elizabethan bridge, which gives the place half its name. Immediately behind it stood the house wherein they had engaged lodgings, whose exterior features are so well known to all travellers through the Froome Valley, once portion of a fine manorial residence and the property and seat of a d'Urberville, but since its partial demolition a farmhouse. "Welcome to one of your ancestral mansions," said Claire, as he handed her down, but he regretted the pleasantry. It was too near a satire. On entering, they found that, though they had only engaged a couple of rooms, the farmer had taken advantage of their proposed presence during the coming days to pay a New Year's visit to some friends, leaving a woman from a neighbouring cottage to minister to their few wants. The absoluteness of possession pleased them, and they realised it as the first moment of their experience under their own exclusive roof tree. But he found that the mouldy old habitation somewhat depressed his pride. When the carriage was gone, they ascended the stairs to wash their hands, the chairwoman showing the way. On the landing, Tess stopped and started. "What's the matter?" said he. "Those horrid women," she answered with a smile. "How they frightened me." He looked up and perceived two life-size portraits on panels built into the masonry. As all visitors to the mansion are aware, these paintings represent women of middle age, of a date some 200 years ago, whose lineaments, once seen, can never be forgotten. The long, pointed features, narrow eye, and smirk of the one, so suggestive of merciless treachery, the bill-hook nose, large teeth, and bold eye of the other, suggesting arrogance to the point of ferocity, haunt the beholder half out of his way to choose the house for their bridal time, went on into the adjoining room. The place having been rather hastily prepared for them, they washed their hands in one basin. Claire touched hers under the water. "Which are my fingers and which are yours?" he said, looking up. "They are very much mixed." "They're all yours," she said very prettily, and endeavoured to be gayer than she was. He had not been displeased with her thoughtfulness on such an occasion. It was what every sensible woman would show. But Tess knew that she had been thoughtful to excess, and struggled against it. The sun was so low on that short last afternoon of the year that it shone in through a small opening and formed a golden staff which stretched across to her skirt, where it made a spot like a paint mark set upon her. They went into the ancient parlour to tea, and here they shared their first common meal alone. Such was their childishness, or rather his, that he found it interesting to use the same bread and butter plate as herself, and to brush crumbs from her lips with his own. He wondered a little that she did not enter into these frivolities with his own zest. Looking at her silently for a long time, "She is a dear, dear Tess," he thought to himself, as one deciding on the true construction of a difficult passage. "Do I realize solemnly enough how utterly and irretrievably this little womanly thing is the creature of my good or bad faith and fortune? I think not. I think I could not, unless I were a woman myself. What I am, she is. What I become, she must become. What I cannot be, she cannot be. And shall I ever neglect her, or hurt her, or even forget to consider her? God forbid such a crime." They sat on over the tea table, waiting for their luggage, which the dairyman had promised to send before it grew dark. But evening began to close in, and the luggage did not arrive, and they had brought nothing more than they stood in. With the departure of the sun, the calm mood of the winter day changed. Out of doors, there began noises as of silk smartly rubbed. The restless, dead leaves of the preceding autumn were stirred to irritated resurrection, and whirled about unwillingly, and tapped against the shutters. It soon began to rain. "That cock knew the weather was going to change," said Claire. The woman who had attended upon them had gone home for the night, but she had placed candles upon the table, and now they lit them. Each candle flame threw towards the fireplace. "These old houses are so draughty," continued Angel, looking at the flames, and at the grease guttering down the sides. "I wonder where that luggage is. We haven't even a brush and comb." "I don't know," she answered, absent-minded. "Tess, you are not a bit cheerful this evening. Not at all as you used to be. Those hardy dents on the panels upstairs haven't settled to you. I'm sorry I brought you here. I wonder if you really love me, after all." He knew that she did, and the words had no serious intent. But she was surcharged with emotions, and winced like a wounded animal. Though she tried not to shed tears, she could not help showing one or two. "I did not mean it," said he, sorry. "You're worried at not having your things, I know. I cannot think why old Jonathan has not come with them. Why, it is 7 o'clock. Ah, there he is." A knock had come to the door, and there being nobody else to answer it, Claire went out. He returned to the room with a small package in his hand. "It is not Jonathan, after all," he said. "How vexing," said Tess. The packet had been brought by a special messenger, who had arrived at the Talbothys from a minister vicarage immediately after the departure of the married couple, and had followed them hither, being under injunction to deliver it into nobody's hands but theirs. Claire brought directed in his father's hand to Mrs. Angel Clare. "It is a little wedding present for you, Tess," said he, handing it to her. "How thoughtful they are." Tess looked a little flustered as she took it. "I think I would rather have you open it, dearest," said she, turning over the parcel. "I don't like to break those great seals. They look so serious. Please open it for me." He undid the parcel. Inside was a case of morocco leather, on top of which lay a note and a key. The note was for Claire, in the following words: "My dear son, possibly you have forgotten that on the death of your godmother, Mrs. Pitney, when you were a lad, she, vain, kind woman that she was, left me a portion of the contents of her jewel case in trust of your wife, if you should ever have one, as a mark of her affection for you and whomsoever you should choose. This trust I have fulfilled, and the diamonds have been locked up at my banker's ever since. Though I feel it to be a somewhat incongruous act in the circumstances, I am, as you will see, bound to hand over the articles to the woman to whom the use of them for her lifetime will now rightly belong, and they are therefore promptly sent. They become, I believe, heirlooms, strictly speaking, according to the terms of your godmother's will. The precise words of the clause that refers to this matter are enclosed." "I do remember," said Claire, "but I had quite forgotten." Unlocking the case, they found it to contain a necklace with pendant, bracelets, and earrings, and some other small ornaments. Tess seemed afraid to touch them at first, but her eyes sparkled for a moment, as much as the stones, when Claire spread out the set. "Are they mine?" she asked incredulously. "They are, certainly," said he. He looked into the fire. He remembered how, when he was a lad of 15, his godmother, the squire's wife, the only rich person with whom he had ever come in contact, had pinned her faith to his success, had prophesied a wondrous career for him. There had seemed nothing at all out of keeping with such a conjectured career in the storing up of these showy ornaments for his wife and the views of her descendants. They gleamed somewhat ironically now. Yet why? He asked himself. It was but a question of vanity throughout, and if that were admitted into one side of the equation, it should be admitted into the other. His wife was a d'Urberville. Could they become better than her? Suddenly, he said with enthusiasm, "Tess, put them on, and he turned from the fire to help her. As if by magic, she had already donned them, necklace, earrings, bracelets, and all. "But the gown isn't right, Tess. It ought to be a low one for a set of brilliants like that." "Ought it?" said Tess. "Yes," said he. He suggested to her how to tuck in the upper edges of her bodice, so as to make it roughly approximate to the cut for evening wear, and when she had done this, and the pendant to the necklace hung isolated amid the whiteness of her throat it was designed to do, he stepped back to survey her. "My heavens," said Claire, "how beautiful you are. As everybody knows, fine feathers make fine birds. A peasant girl, but very moderately prepossessing to the casual observer in her simple condition and attire, will bloom as an amazing beauty if clothed as a woman of fashion with the aids that art can render, while the beauty of the midnight crush would often cut but a sorry figure if placed inside the field woman's wrapper upon a monotonous acreage of turnips on a dull day." He had never till now estimated the artistic excellence of Tess's limbs and features. "If you were only to appear in a dearest, I think I love you best in the wing bonnet and cotton frock. Yes, better than in this. Well, as you support these indignities. Tess's sense of her striking appearance had given her a flush of excitement, which was yet not happiness. I'll take them off, she said, in case Jonathan should see them. They are not fit for me, are they? They must be sold, I suppose. Let them stay a few minutes longer. Sell them? Never. It would be a breach of faith. Influenced by a second thought, she readily obeyed. She had something to tell, and there might be help in these. She sat down with the jewels upon her, and they again indulged in conjectures as to where Jonathan could possibly be with their baggage. The ale they had poured out for his consumption when he came had gone flat with long standing. Shortly after this, they began supper, which was already laid on a side table. Ere they had finished, there was a jerk in the fire smoke, the rising skein of which bulged out into the room, as if some giant had laid his hand on the chimney top for a moment. It had been caused by the opening of the outer door. A heavy step was now heard in the passage, and Angel went out. I couldn't make nobody hear at all by knocking, apologised Jonathan Gale, for it was he at last. And as 'twas raining out, I opened the door. I've brought the things, sir. I am very glad to see them, but you are very late. Well, yes, sir. There was something subdued in Jonathan Gale's tone, which had not been there in the day, and lines of concern were ploughed upon his forehead, in addition to the lines of years. He continued, We've all been galled at the dairy at what might have been a most terrible affliction, since you and your missus, so to name her now, left us this afternoon. Perhaps you hadn't forgotten the cock's afternoon crow. Dear me, what? Well, some say it do mean one thing, and some another. But what's happened is that poor little Reddy Brittle have tried to drown herself. No, really? Why, she bade us goodbye with the rest. Yes, well, sir, when you and your missus, so to name what she lawful is, when you two drove away, as I say, Reddy and Marianne put on their bonnets and went out. And as there is not much doing now, being New Year's Eve, and folks mops and brooms from what's inside 'em, nobody took much notice. They went on to Leweverard, where they had somewhat to drink, and then on they vamped to the Three-Armed Cross, and there they seemed to have parted. Reddy striking across the water meads as if for home, and Marianne going on to the next village, where there is another public house. Nothing more was seen or heard already, till the motorman, on his way home, noticed something by the great pool. 'Twas her bonnet and shawl packed up. In the water he found her. He and another man brought her home, thinking was dead, but she came round by degrees. Angel, suddenly recollecting that Tess was overhearing this gloomy tale, went to shut the door between the passage and the parlour, but his wife, flinging a shawl round her, had approached and listened to the man's narrative, her eyes resting absently on the luggage, and the drops of rain glistening upon it. And more than this, there's Marianne. She's been found dead drunk by the withy bed, a girl who have never been known to touch anything before except shilling ale, though, to be sure, I was always a good trencher woman, as her face showed. It seems as if the maids had all gone out of their minds. And is? Asked Tess. Is about the house as usual, but I do say I can guess how it happened, and she seems to be very low in mind about it, poor maid, as well she may be. And so, you see, sir, all this happened just when we was packing your few traps and your missus's night rail and dressing things into the cart. Why, it belated me. Yes. Well, Jonathan, will you get the trunks upstairs and drink a cup of ale, and hasten back as soon as you can, in case you should be wanted? Tess had gone back to the parlour and sat down by the fire, looking wistfully into it. She heard Jonathan Gale's heavy footsteps up and down the stairs till he had done placing the luggage, and heard him express his thanks for the ale her husband took out to him, and for the gratuity he had received. Jonathan's footsteps then died from the door, and his cart creaked away. Angel slid forward the massive oak bar which secured the door, and, coming in to where she sat over the hearth, pressed her cheeks between his hands from behind. He expected her to jump up gaily and unpack the toilet gear that she had been so anxious about, but as she did not rise, he sat down with her in the firelight, the candles on the supper table being too thin and glimmering to interfere with its glow. I am so sorry you should have heard this sad news about the girls, he said. Still, don't let it depress you. Reddy was naturally morbid, you know. Without the least cause, said Tess, while they who have cause to be hide it and pretend they are not. This incident had turned the scale for her. They were simple and innocent girls, on whom the unhappiness of unrequited love had fallen. They had deserved better at the hands of fate. She had deserved worse, yet she was the chosen one. It was wicked of her to take all without paying. She would pay to the uttermost farthing. She would tell there and then. This final determination she came to when she looked into the fire, he holding her hand. A steady crimson glare from the now flameless embers painted the sides and backs of the fireplace with its colour, and the well-polished andirons and the old brass tongs that would not meet. The underside of the mantel shelf was flushed with a blood-coloured light, and the legs of the table nearest the fire. Tess's face and neck reflected the same warmth, which each gem turned into an Aldebaran or a Sirius, a constellation of white, red, and green flashes that interchanged their hues with every pulsation. Do you remember what we said to each other this morning about telling our faults? He asked abruptly, finding that she still remained immovable. We spoke lightly, perhaps, and you may well have done so, but for me, it was no light promise. I want to make a confession to you, love. This, from him, so unexpectedly opposite, had the effect upon her of a providential interposition. You have to confess something, she said quickly, and even with gladness and relief. You did not expect it. You thought too highly of me. Now, listen, put your head there, because I want you to forgive me, and not to be indignant with me for not telling you before, as perhaps I ought to have done. How strange it was. He seemed to be her double. She did not speak, and Claire went on. I did not mention it because I was afraid of endangering my chance of you, darling, the great prize of my life. My fellowship, I call you. My brother's fellowship was one at his college. Mine at Talbothy's Dairy. Well, I would not risk it. I was going to tell you a month ago. At the time you agreed to be mine, but I could not. I thought it might frighten you away from me. I put it off. Then I thought I would tell you yesterday, to give you a chance, at least, of escaping me. But I did not. And I did not this morning, when you proposed our confessing our faults on the landing, the sinner that I was. But I must. Now I see you sitting there so solemnly. I wonder if you will forgive me. Oh yes, I am sure that. Well, I hope so. But wait a minute, you don't know. To begin at the beginning, though I believe my poor father fears that I am one of the eternally lost for the doctrines, I am a stickler for good morals, Tess. I used to wish to be a teacher of men, and it was a great disappointment to me when I found I could not enter the church. I loved spotlessness and hated impurity as I do now. Whatever I may think of plenary inspiration, I heartily subscribe to those words of Paul, "Be thou an example, in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity." It is the only safeguard for us poor human beings. Integra vitae, says a Roman poet, who is strange company for St. Paul. The man of upright life, from frailties free, stands not in need of Moorish spear or bow. Well, having felt this so strongly, you will see what a terrible remorse it bred in me when I, my very self, fell. He then told her of that time of his life, to which allusion has been made, when, tossed about by doubts and difficulties, like a cork on the waves, he went to London and plunged into 8 and 40 hours dissipation with a stranger. Happily, I awoke almost immediately to a sense of my folly, he continued. I would have no more to say to her, and I came home. I have never repeated the offence, but I felt I should like to treat you with perfect frankness and honour, and I could not do so without telling this. Do you forgive me? She pressed his hand tightly for an answer. Then we will dismiss it at once and forever, too painful as it is for the occasion, and talk of something lighter. Oh, Angel, I am almost glad, because now you can forgive me. I have not made my confession. I have a confession too. Remember, I said so. Ah, to be sure. Now then for it, the wicked little one. Perhaps, although you smile, it is as serious as yours, or more so. It can hardly be more serious, dearest. It cannot. Oh, no, it cannot. She jumped up joyfully at the hope. No, it cannot be more serious, certainly, she cried. I will tell you now. She sat down again. Their hands were still joined. The ashes under the grate were lit by the fire vertically, like a torrid waste. Her imagination beheld a last day luridness in this red cold glow, which fell on his face and hand, and on hers, peering into the loose hair about her brow, and firing the delicate skin underneath. A large shadow of her shape rose upon the wall and ceiling. She bent forward, at which each diamond on her neck gave a sinister wink like a toad's, and, pressing her forehead against his temple, she entered on her story of her acquaintance with